I'm really concerned about how we keep the lights on. The risk factors are coming from, can we maintain the flows of gas into the market in cold weather in the winter if we allow the North Sea infrastructure to erode too far?
All it needs is for the government to remove the EPL immediately at the budget in 2 weeks' time, publish what they so-called Future of the North Sea consultation, and allow a pragmatic and sensible future licensing regime, take action on granting consents for new developments, starting with Rosebank and Jackdaw, and 4, and this is a slightly softer but equally important one, change the tone to one of championing an industry in which the UK is a world leader.
As Keir Starmer and Ed Miliband returned from COP30, I wanted to take a look at the UK's energy policy amidst a global backdrop that suggests the world is turning away from net zero absolutism and towards a more human-centric policy choice. The Overton window on energy policy is being pushed aside by the likes of Tony Blair, Bill Gates, and significantly by the lobbying interests of big technology, and resource nationalism is being reasserted. In the run-up to the next general election, the UK's energy policy will form a key battleground, and in particular, our sky-high energy prices and the future of our North Sea hydrocarbon industry will be critical factors in that debate. So I was delighted to be joined last week by Kathryn Porter, What Logic energy consultant and Telegraph columnist, and Martin Copeland, Chief Financial Officer of North Sea oil and gas operator Serica Energy, for a discussion about the UK's energy policy and the future of the North Sea. It was a hugely insightful conversation. While we covered a lot of ground, the key question is whether the UK is prepared to sacrifice its North Sea oil and gas industry to the god of net zero. While it has been severely damaged already, it is not too late for government policy to save the jobs and energy reserves at stake, but action is needed in the upcoming budget. This significant event could mark the turning point for an industry on the brink of being destroyed by the irrational pursuit of territorial net zero at all costs. As ever, none of what you are about to hear is any kind of advice, but hopefully you will find it both entertaining and informative. Please take personal financial advice before investing a penny of your money in these crazy markets. And with that said, please enjoy my conversation with Kathryn Porter and Martin Copeland.
Brought to you by Progressive Equity.
Okay, Kathryn, can we just start with the state of the UK energy market? Can you just give us a quick overview, please?
We obviously have a lot of concerns in the UK at the moment around the high prices that we're paying for our energy. And mostly what we mean about that is gas and electricity. It's now pretty well understood that we have the highest industrial electricity prices in the developed world and the fourth highest domestic electricity prices in the developed world. But the narrative that this is really because of gas is starting to fall apart. Our gas prices are actually only the 15th highest. And we've seen gas prices come off very significantly. They're about 87% down from the highs of 2022. And now it's pretty widely accepted in the industry that new LNG projects that have come on stream will fully replace Russian gas by the end of this year. And so we could see prices falling back to the long-term averages that we saw in the 20-25 years leading up to the sort of beginning of the gas crisis in late 2021. And of course, people forget that actually it all started before Ukraine. So if we do see gas prices reverting to those long-term norms, then any arguments that gas is responsible for our high electricity bills will completely fall away. And I think we saw the senior executives from the supply companies giving evidence to parliamentary select committees recently, where they were saying that the main drivers of those high electricity bills are actually policy costs, and a lot of concern around the current subsidy round that's in progress at the moment, which is widely expected to price higher than last year, and last year's prices were actually at or above the cost of generating electricity using gas. So we're really quite clearly seeing that renewables are the driver of our electricity bills, and that in a falling gas price context, you can't really sustain that argument anymore that gas is responsible.
What are the costs between the wholesale gas price and our energy bill, our retail energy bills?
I wrote a report last year where I looked at, so it was published actually in May, looking at the drivers of our costs and really the true cost of renewables and net zero. And I took wholesale gas and electricity data going back to the late 1990s, and also household spend on electricity also over the same period. And what you find from those data, if you look up to about 2006, you had three pretty flat lines. You had the wholesale gas price was low and stable. The wholesale electricity price was a little higher, which is what you'd expect if you're using gas as your primary input for generating electricity. And then you'd add on some additional costs for distribution and things like billing and so on to get to the costs that households would pay. From 2006 onwards, though, we saw up until late 2021, the wholesale gas and electricity prices continued to be low and stable. But the amount that households were spending, the electricity bill, if you like, began to increase significantly. So it diverged from the wholesale electricity price. And so by the end of 2021, there was actually a very significant difference between the wholesale electricity price and the bills that we were paying. So what's the reason for that difference? It didn't suddenly become more expensive to distribute electricity or for suppliers to operate billing systems. What was really driving it was the energy transition. We actually began subsidizing wind back in 1990. It's interesting, actually, that the start of us subsidizing wind broadly coincides with the start of us using gas in the electricity market. And gas is considered this very old and well-established and mature technology that didn't require any subsidies. And for some reason, wind was different and did require subsidies. And so we started these subsidies 35 years ago, and they've just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And yes, we did see some reductions in the early years, and that was reflecting technology developments. But after the mid-2010s, the capital costs of wind stopped falling, and the operating costs also stopped falling. And then they actually began to reverse and go up. And really now, those technologies, their cost dynamics are no longer driven by learning curve experiences. They're driven by the same things that drive cost in other mature industries, which is, your raw material supply chains, your energy costs, your labor costs, and so on. And all of those factors have been going up. So we have this component of growing subsidies, both in terms of volume, because we've been trying to build more, and also in terms of price. And then a huge amount of the cost comes from the fact that renewables have very low energy density. This means that you need an awful lot more wires to connect them. And a lot of this infrastructure is being built in places that didn't have existing infrastructure already. And that all gets added onto bills. And it's also interesting to note, because this is a huge hidden subsidy that wind gets that isn't true in the oil and gas sector. If you want to drill a new well, develop a new oil or gas field in a part of the offshore environment that doesn't have existing infrastructure, then you would have to build your own new pipeline to the shore, and you pay for it. The oil or gas company pays for that pipeline. If you want to go and put a wind farm in the middle of the North Sea where there's no existing infrastructure, who pays for the wires to bring that electricity to the shore? The consumers do. That gets added onto bills. So that's a massive hidden subsidy for wind producers. So they get the big direct subsidies that cover the capital costs of building the wind farms. They get all these hidden subsidies for the connections and the grid infrastructure. Then there's the fact that it's not always windy. So you have to then make sure you've got other generation available to cover that. And that's primarily gas-fired power stations. So they have to get paid extra revenues. That's an additional cost of renewables that gets added directly onto bills. It's called the capacity market. And then you have the fact that wind and sun are intermittent in real time. And unlike gas, where you can compress gas and you can store it in the pipes, you can't store electricity in the wires and you can't compress it. So you have to balance supply and demand very closely in real time. Now, if your supply is varying a lot in real time because, clouds are going in front of the sun and there's gusts of wind, that makes that task of balancing supply and demand difficult. And a fundamental property of electricity is that has to be balanced very closely within plus or minus 1%. And so this costs money. And we can see this. The balancing costs have gone up by billions of pounds a year. And all of these costs get added straight onto bills. So you've got your wholesale price, and then suddenly you've got all these policy costs, you've got these extra network costs, you've got these extra balancing costs. And that is really what's responsible for the divergence of the retail electricity price from the wholesale price. And it means you're forcing your entire gas infrastructure now to act as a massive source of swing. That means you've got to have flexibility of gas coming into the grid. Your gas power stations have to behave in a much more flexible way than they were designed to operate. And the National Energy System Operator, NESO, has this notion that 35 gigawatts of gas generating capacity will only be used 5% of the time by 2030. Now, almost all of that capacity is combined cycle technology, and these machines are actually quite finicky, and they don't actually like being not run. If you don't run your CCGT for a week to 10 days, that you're going to start getting issues with your boiler chemistry. And so you really will have to start thinking about proper preservation if you're not going to use your plant that often. You'd have to start doing an awful lot of stuff to keep those assets in good working order that you wouldn't otherwise do, that's going to involve cost, because they're just fundamentally not designed to be used in that way. And a lot of them are very old. A third of our gas fleet was built in the 1990s. These assets are approaching end of life. So A, taking end of life assets and operating them in ways they weren't designed to run is a recipe for disaster. But B, we can't afford to lose that capacity. With almost 5 gigawatts of nuclear set to close over the next 5 years, the government has all of these plans for electrification. We're not going to be able to keep the lights on unless we really urgently look at refreshing those gas assets. And of course, they're being neglected because the government's all rah-rah about wind. And of course, the wind is extremely unreliable.
Talking of things being neglected, just wanted to turn to Martin and just give us an overview of, given what Kathryn has told us about the overarching issues of the UK energy market, can you do the same for the North Sea sector?
As Kathryn's laid it out for the electricity sector, it's actually policy choices over a very long period of time. In the oil and gas sector, it's actually not over such a long period of time, but recently it has been really, really bad policy, and policy that keeps getting worse. So, you will have seen statistics out there that is a signal of how bad it is, that not a single exploration well was drilled in the North Sea in 2025. That's the first time that's happened since 1964 when we started developing the North Sea.
Had we actually discovered any hydrocarbons in the North Sea in 1964? I think those were the very I was only 4 years old, so I wasn't really paying attention.
I wasn't born, but that was the very, very early days of wildcatting for the North Sea. So it was the very, very beginnings, clearly. But look, we haven't had a single one drilled, and every single year since there have been. I spend quite a lot of time talking with government, and you hear them now saying, oh, yes, but there's still capital spending going on. And 2023 and 24, there was capital spending going on. But that absolutely misses the point about what the impact is on our industry. This is an industry, and it's probably similar in what Kathryn's been talking about, which has very long lead times. If you needed to fix some of the CCGTs that Kathryn's talking about, the order times are huge. We operate in a world where the minimum lead time is 1 to 2 years, even if you just want to drill one infill well. So when the government sees statistics about capital spend going on in the last couple of years and saying we see that windfall tax, the energy profits levy, hasn't caused damage, the problem with that is that those decisions were taken 3+ years ago at a time when either the windfall tax didn't exist or it wasn't nearly as punitive as it is today. So exploration drilling is the leading indicator. It's the canary in the coal mine, and it's telling us something about what the state of the industry is today. So we certainly hope that the government will take heed of that. Of course, we're doing this podcast at a very interesting time. We've got the budget coming up in about 2 weeks' time, and there are some really, really key decisions that need to be taken very soon.
What I read of that report that you referred to, in the same period, I think in Norway, in the Norwegian sector of the North Sea, they're expecting to drill 39 wells. They've already drilled 30 so far this year.
In Norway, the industry is alive and kicking, and it's because they've had consistent policy. And sometimes you hear this stuff about our tax rate being the same as Norway. Literally the only thing about our tax rate for the North Sea that's the same as Norway is the number 78. Every single other thing about it is very, very different. The Norwegian system is a very balanced, fair system that actually incentivizes activity in the sector. and supports their industry. Even though it is a high rate, it's a high and consistent rate that's always been at that level, and it has very good capital and investment allowances. It's just a very, very different system.
One of the things that people say about it not being a problem that the North Sea is underinvested is because it's a declining basin and it's all going to end anyway. So I have two issues with that. One is that there's just really no such thing as an infinite natural resource. If you discover a new coal mine, for example, nobody says, oh, you know what, we're not going to mine this coal because one day it'll run out, which seems to be the argument people are using around the North Sea. And the other thing is that Norway just made a massive discovery just on our doorstep. It's literally adjacent to the UK continental shelf. It's probably even the same reservoir. And it's about equivalent to about 1% to 2% of our reserves or something. So there's definitely stuff out there that we can still find. And technology means that stuff that we know about from previous exploration activity in years gone by can be viable when it might not have been at the time.
That's a really good point.
Loads of oil and gas for us still to get out.
That's a really good point, Kathryn. I mean, the thing that's impacting the activity is absolutely policy, not geology. I can give an example to your point on technology. And we as a small company, but we just developed a field called the Belinda field. It was originally discovered probably in the late 60s, and they drilled a vertical well into it. It was about 10 million barrels of production. Wasn't deemed economic at the time, was kind of left, and no one did anything with it. We went back in this year and drilled a horizontal well into it, so we can obviously therefore exploit it more efficiently, and we can tie it back to our own existing infrastructure, and it's very economic. So it's very easy seeing these charts just showing natural decline. It isn't always like that. What says how much reserves there are is an economic test, not just a geological test.
Yes, I think it was Dan Jurgen who said, say over the last 40, 50 years, something like 85 or 90% of our known oil reserves are extensions of technical developments of existing fields.
Absolutely. And in fact, that's what the UK sector of the North Sea is mostly that, right? It's most of the stuff that's there. And that's why this policy debate about banning new exploration drilling is so wrong-headed. And most of the licensing that goes on in the UK is not for virgin acreage that's never been drilled before. It's mostly stuff that's been drilled in the past and it's gone back to the government. So it's discovered resource. It's not exploration.
But Serica particularly has remained in the North Sea and active in the North Sea. I mean, you've been doing deals recently. Why are you doing it, given the conditions that prevail?
Yeah, you might think we're mad by doing that. But, in some ways, the fact that we're able to do these deals means that there are people selling out. And they're either selling out because they are large companies who have essentially given up on the UK and taken the view that they will invest almost anywhere else other than the UK because the combination of policy and fiscal is so unattractive. Or they're companies that have literally got themselves into financial trouble. I mean, we just bought some assets from the Prax Group, and that was because their main business, the refinery, the Lindsey Oil Refinery, basically got into financial trouble and the company went into administration. In part, again, because of policy, because of being led costs on top of what they were doing at the refining sector. So, yes, we've been able to pick things up, but it's not exactly a sign of the thriving environment. It's more a sign that those people are selling for those reasons. The other part of it, though, Jeremy, is that we do think that there are some signs that there's a bit of a shift going on in sentiment.
Yes. Okay, this is what I want to get to. Yep.
The current government's policy was basically the product of some very effective but very minority niche special interest groups whose main agenda was to shut down the North Sea. And they basically ended up setting the government's policy when it was in opposition. But that wasn't the policy based on extensive consultation and evidence basis. It was a TikTok generation meme culture soundbite policy that they implemented, and it's now become government policy. But what's happened since then, and I have to say, we as an industry haven't been the best at our own comms effort, right? We were playing catch up on the comms front. And I'm relatively new to the sector, but I think some of that comes from the fact that the people that make up most oil and gas companies are engineers typically, or lawyers. And their whole approach is generally to be very evidence-based, very fact-based. And so they're not as good at the kind of quick comms culture. And so what we've had to do is carefully make the arguments. And I think we've been now getting better at doing that. And I think when you do make those arguments, and you're seeing now both of the key opposition parties, the Conservatives and Reform, have clearly shifted their policy. And even someone like Dale Vince, who, as I've commented to others, is literally the second least likely person in the whole of the UK that I thought might express these views, has said that he thinks that we should continue with the North Sea. And I think the reason why it's shifting is people do begin to see how nonsensical an idea it is to shut down our industry in the North Sea. And
how close are we to not being able to get it back in terms of the damage, the scarring that's being done?
I think it's fair to say, and that's not an exaggeration, and I'm sure people always think that the industry is going to call for signs of crisis. But the reality is the warning signs are there. It's flashing code red right now. What you can see is the drip of news announcements of job losses. We're an industry that supports at the moment 200,000 jobs in the UK, and we're losing them at a rate of roughly 1,000 a month right now. But then, more importantly, in some ways, are the less publicised but equally damaging effects. We're seeing equipment services companies in the supply chain leave the UK. For instance, Hunting PLC, it's moved its UK facilities to Dubai. And in that case, they didn't just move the people, they're literally shipping over the entire factory, machine tools and everything to Dubai from Scotland. That is something we should absolutely see as a red flag signal. We've seen rigs leave the basin for places where oil and gas extraction remains buoyant, of course, often just to Norway, which is, as we've just been saying, literally the same piece of sea just across the water to find work. And we're risking hitting tipping points on key pieces of critical infrastructure, which could then cause a dramatic and chaotic decline. So again, government looks at charts, and when consultants and the NSTA produce charts, they do nice, smooth decline curves. It won't necessarily be a nice, smooth decline curve. Ultimately, the production has to go through infrastructure. Kathryn was making the point, and she rightly made the point, that if we need to produce oil and gas fields, we have to build our own infrastructure. But if the infrastructure goes, you could still have the reserves and the production viable, but it can't get to market. So you could have dramatic and disorderly decline. And we're right at that point. The action is needed now, and it's extremely real.
So we actually have National Gas warning about this. They operate the high-pressure transmission system for gas across GB. And they're saying that, as early as next year, we might not be able to get enough molecules into the grid on cold winter days to meet demand because of declines in the North Sea. Because if those pipeline infrastructure, and this applies to oil as well, but that's obviously not impacting our domestic markets, household electricity and gas in the same way. If those pipelines stop being viable because there's not enough oil or gas entering them, that you have to shut them down, you'll lose a big chunk of supply in a very sudden way. So I think there's an ignorance piece here where policymakers simply don't understand how the physical infrastructure operates. And they've been far too driven by these ideological arguments about just stopping oil and not really thinking it through in terms of what that means in a context where we're actually not reducing our demand, except as a result of deindustrialization, which is obviously a very damaging form of demand destruction that we want to reverse. So allowing this infrastructure to go off in a disorderly fashion is actually a massive risk to energy security.
So what can we expect or hope for, perhaps, in the upcoming budget?
The fact that the problems we've got for our industry are self-inflicted. They're self-inflicted by the combination of policy initiatives, regulation, and tax. The fact that they're self-inflicted wounds is also possibly an optimistic aspect, because being self-inflicted wounds, they can also be self-healed by the right policy choices, as long as they're taken quickly. All it needs, and this is going to sound simple, all it needs is for the government to remove the EPL immediately at the budget in 2 weeks' time, publish what they so-called Future of the North Sea consultation, and allow a pragmatic and sensible future licensing regime, take action on granting consents for new developments, starting with Rosebank and Jackdaw, and 4, and this is a slightly softer but equally important one, change the tone to one of championing an industry in which the UK is a world leader, and vocally support an enormous competitive benefit that the UK still enjoys, which is a rarity compared to most of our continental European peers, of being blessed with our own domestic hydrocarbons resources. And what's great about that, if they did do that, unlike other industries, Kathryn was mentioning the amount of subsidies that goes into the renewables space. We don't need the subsidies. We just need to revert back to a tax rate that we had before 2022, which was 40%. Remember, again, that's still significantly higher than the main corporation tax rate in the UK. And we've also confirmed to government that we could live with a permanent windfall tax, but just one that's designed properly, that actually properly taxes real windfalls. And even if they did that, the industry's indicated that there are £50 billion worth of new investments that'll be back on the table. That ranges from big high-profile projects to the less sexy but equally important infills and tiebacks. And as compared to other investment-driven growth ambitions, such as housing, grid infrastructure, solar farms, The beauty of developing in the North Sea is nobody lives there. Of course, we need to follow proper regulation and environmental controls, but we can get things done and built, not mired in endless local NIMBYist opposition. And unlike the renewables sector, our supply chain is just about still here in the UK, which means when we invest, UK economic benefits are genuine economic growth multipliers, not offshoring manufacturing and skilled engineering to other countries and just doing the last mile installation here. So it really should be a win-win outcome.
When I read the article in the FT saying that Rachel Reeves was considering easing back the profits levy from 2029, so this is not going to happen tomorrow, but she'd been consulting with the industry, people like you, Martin, to make sure that if she did that, you would be good boys and spend money.
We've been very clear, though, as an industry to government, that announcing that they're going to take this tax away in 2029 will not have the effect that they expect. You might say, well, why not? Because it's fine. You could invest now and get capital allowances at the higher tax rate, and then most of your economic rent would come at a lower tax rate when it goes down. The problem is there is a complete lack of trust from the industry now with not just this government, to be fair, with UK governments as a whole. It was the prior government as well. And that trust has gone in the boardrooms that would make the investment decisions. So it's a believe it when we see it type attitude today, as you would expect in private sector companies making decisions for investment when they can make them here or elsewhere. So our unequivocal message is that the tax needs to go now, and we can implement the permanent windfall tax, which would protect against super spikes like we saw for a short while during 2022. But that would then allow us to invest, and there's plenty for us to go after. But equally, it needs to be joined up policy. It can't just be tax. It needs to be taxed together with the regulatory side so that it all works together.
I'm a little frustrated, actually, with the sector in terms of its messaging. I think the sector has allowed, and it's not just in Britain, I think this is around the world, oil and gas companies have allowed the environmentalists to steal the agenda. People do not have this link in their minds between hydrocarbons and daily life.
Absolutely.
If we stopped using natural gas for making fertilizer, if we stopped that overnight, 40% of the world would fall into famine. We saw in Sri Lanka what happened when they banned the use of synthetic fertilizer. It was one of the fastest economic collapses in history. There's almost nothing in a hospital setting apart from the people and a few bits of paper that are not made out of oil. You know, if you describe what happens to a person going to get chemotherapy, for example, they walk through a door made out of oil on a floor covered in oil, past walls covered in oil. They might look through a window made out of oil. They go sit on a chair made out of oil when a tube made out of oil connects into a machine made out of oil that brings drugs made out of oil into their body. There's literally nothing going on there that isn't made out of oil. And modern technology also wouldn't exist without oil. So, it's one of my favorite things when I'm arguing with people on Twitter and they're like, yeah, we've got to just stop oil. I'm like, well, why are you on social media then? Because presumably if oil is so bad, you wouldn't be using the oil products. And of course, that would mean you'd have to stop using technology. Everything will have been transported using hydrocarbons, or it would have been grown using hydrocarbons, or it would have been dug out of the ground using hydrocarbons, or it would be using hydrocarbons in fundamental ways which are embedded in all of our modern technology. You just can't do it. And so it's so puerile to say we're going to stop oil. And I think it's such a shame that the industry hasn't been much more vocal to raise that public awareness.
I'm not going to dispute your argument side, and also not going to dispute that the industry as a whole, and I would say the bigger companies have not been great at articulating those messages. They did for a while, but then they got into this whole sort of cancel culture mode, which made it really difficult, and execs didn't want to do that. And so, maybe it's shifting a bit. We as a purely UK company, we kind of focus more on the things here. But even there, sort of to Kathryn's point, even if you take the statistics of the Climate Change Committee with their net zero 2050 scenario, even under that, and that's probably disputable as to whether that will actually be achieved, but let's just assume for a moment that it will. Even under that, the Climate Change Committee says we need between 12 and 15 billion barrels of oil equivalent in the UK between now and then. And that's because 75 to 80% of our primary energy demand is still oil and gas. So, people think about it as just the power generation when we hear the Clean Power 2030, but that's really only a very small part of the overall. I mean, people got to clearly think about the heating, but clearly Kathryn's rightly made the point. It's in everything that we use and make, etc. So vast amounts of our primary energy demand. Currently we could produce just on current policy about 4 billion of that 12 to 15. If we had the right investment policy, we could do about 8. So we're still going to be a net importer. But the question is, why on earth would you not want to maximize the domestic production? Because the domestic production brings jobs to the UK, creates economic value here, pays taxes here, and even better, relative to the fact that otherwise we'll just import it, it's better for the global climate and emissions because clearly we don't have to pay the emissions of shipping the hydrocarbons here. It really does seem like a no-brainer of a policy.
It's not just the emissions aspects of sustainability, it's the wider aspects as well. We have some of the highest environmental standards in the world around our production. If you start having to import from other places, they might not be so strict around leaks, for example.
The UK industry has already improved its emissions footprint by 28% since the North Sea Transition Deal was put in place only a few years ago. We're on a track to improve that over time. We are spending money, all the companies in the North Sea are spending money to reduce flaring, to reduce methane emissions. There's a huge amount of effort that goes into controlling that. And of course, very, very tight set of safety and workers' rights type controls, none of which necessarily applies in the places we'll be importing hydrocarbons from.
This is quite a live issue, I think, in Westminster and in the Labour Party as well. It's this whole question of importing versus producing our own hydrocarbons. I think it is now sort of being much more widely accepted that in a world where you're not really reducing consumption, or at least not enough to make a difference, importing instead of making your own is not really very easy to justify. It's starting to come to a point where we might be pushing at an open door. And yes, there's the sort of the resistance element of not wanting to break manifesto promises, but they're about to increase income tax. So I think the manifesto promises are a bit of a moot point right now. And so this point about taking away the EPL in 2029, I mean, I think the industry has got to be having an expectation that in 2029 it's going to go anyway because Labour will lose the election. If this government lasts till 2029, which, you know, people are starting to discuss that it might not, which is insane considering the size of their parliamentary majority. But nevertheless, you know, if they did survive to 2029, they're not likely to win that election. And both Conservatives and Reform have said they'll get rid of the EPL. I take the points around trust, but I think when you look at the fiscal consequences of not getting rid of the EPL and the acceleration of the depreciation liability, the decommissioning liabilities, that actually provides an element of credibility that was potentially lacking previously. Because if these parties communicate that they understand that without action, that, you know, the Treasury will start being a net payer under the decommissioning regime, and this will be billions of pounds a year leaving the Treasury instead of billions of pounds coming in, then it becomes fairly credible for those parties to say we're going to get rid of the EPL because we want to avoid that. We want to defer it, push it back into the 2040s. And so that does sort of take care of the credibility points to a certain extent.
And Kathryn, we get this argument sometimes from them which says, well, look, we've got these capital allowances, and it's true that we can get good capital relief against investments that we make under the current tax regime, even at the 78%. And it's worth reminding people it is 78%. I mean, you know, people sometimes, when I talk to them, generally people out there, they kind of think, really, 78%? Can it really be? And of course it is. But we do have these good capital allowances. But the point that I think sometimes ministers and government officials sort of didn't realize is that we do need to actually have the cash to be able to invest in the projects, right? So when the rest of our business is being squeezed at 78%, it's just less cash flow going around that can be allocated into doing the investment. And, you know, we want to invest just for the same reasons that you're saying, Kathryn, because actually government and industry are on the same page around the decommissioning. It's in everybody's interest to push that out as far as we possibly can, to eke out the infrastructure for as long as we possibly can. Because yes, government picks up some of the tab, but the industry picks up the rest, right? And it's in our mutual interest to have that extended. And that's what we're about. That is what the industry has always been about. And we can carry on doing it. And it's not dead. And that's the thing. Sometimes if you listen to popular rhetoric, you'd think it was dead. It's absolutely not.
No, and I think that's part of also the selling job that the sector needs to be doing, is to really get the public understanding that. I think that in the next couple of years, the whole question around the fiscal aspect will start to become more pressing as it starts creeping into the OBR's forecasting period. I think with it now being just outside, it's not entirely on the radar. But, you know, once the OBR starts factoring that in, then I think that'll start scaring the Treasury a little bit.
Well, don't get me started on OBR forecasts and how that works. That's probably a whole nother podcast for Jeremy. But my one quick one on that is I honestly think a very simple and good policy for the UK as a whole would be to make the forecast period 10 years, not 5 years.
Yeah. Is it credible to think that there will be a sufficient climb down from Ed Miliband and other members of the cabinet to allow this to really happen?
So let me comment on that, because obviously, yes, you're right, Jeremy. I mean, we as a company operating in the UK, we obviously have to and want to work with our government. And we know that they will be our government for the next, at least until 2029 is, of course, our assumption, when there will have to be a general election. So whilst we obviously understand and see what the policies are of the opposition parties, our focus is on working with the government to help them respond sensibly to the consultations that they have launched. The problem that we've had is that they've been in power now since July last year, and we've only had consultations. We haven't had policy decisions. And as a result, we've talked about there only having been no exploration wells drilled. There's also, I don't think, been any new projects sanctioned in that time. And that's a gap in the whole system, basically because of policy absence. So we need the policies to come around. However, I think we've also indicated that the signals are getting better, right? I have heard creep into discourse the words, we're going to be pragmatic. And obviously there was the article we talked about in terms of the tax. So I do think there is a policy direction that is shifting. I think they can square it with their own, the base under which they got elected. It is absolutely going to be about driving economic growth, about the arguments that we've all talked about here, that it's actually just economically and climate-wise rational to produce domestically. So I think there is a way of squaring that circle. And we would like to work with the government to help encourage that pivot, or let's say, even, they don't like using the words U-turn, and I don't think it needs to be a U-turn. It's a pragmatic pivot. We would love to encourage that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we all need to be sort of adults when it comes to these discussions around policy change and position change. There's a lot of people criticising the Conservatives for rowing back on net zero 2050, for example, and saying, oh, well, you made these errors in the first place, so how can we trust you? And, finger pointing. And that's just not helpful. What we really want is for policymakers to both adapt to changing circumstances and to recognise that they might have just got something wrong, and that, then we applaud when they get back on the right track and move forward
100%.
Without sort of making a big drama about them changing their minds or whatever. What matters is we get there in the end, and sooner rather than later, and that we try and take away some of that political risk from the whole, U-turn narrative. And this is where I think if the sector was a bit more muscular when it came to discourse with the public and helping the public to understand just how important hydrocarbons are to their lives, we wouldn't be facing that negativity. And then when, the minority who are very hardline about wanting to stop oil and gas start making their noises, then they'll be facing resistance from people saying, no, actually, we want to have hydrocarbons underpinning our technology, and, it's important for the healthcare and all the rest of it, and not just, having this whole climate argument driving everything.
Kathryn, I wanted to ask you about Norway, because Norway not only can show us how to operate a hydrocarbon policy in the North Sea, but it's also pretty critical for us in terms of them supplying us with electricity. And there seems to be a growing sort of climate of energy and resource nationalism afoot that makes us particularly vulnerable in that regard.
Yeah, so, but we started it. This actually comes from our energy nationalism, where we decided that we were going to outsource construction of power generation to other countries and import the electricity back through cables. And we did that. And so now we can't meet our own demand domestically anymore. We rely on interconnectors importing almost all of the time. And what's happened in Norway is that in NO2, which is the southern part of Norway, which is where their interconnectors with Britain and Germany land, and they opened two big interconnectors both at the same time, one with us and one with Germany, they've seen prices in that region of Norway increase by a factor of 10. The Norwegian government now subsidises households up to 90% of their energy bills. They've, over decades, invested billions and billions of Norwegian kroner into their hydro system in order for them to have cheap electricity. They originally built the interconnectors to give them insurance against occasional dry years. And what they found is that because countries like Britain have underinvested, that makes our prices high, also because of our policy. And so that sucks electricity out of their markets. And so as a result, it's almost always cheaper for us to import electricity from Norway than it is for us to try and generate it ourselves or to import it from anywhere else. So that's consuming all the water in the Norwegian reservoirs. They've had some very tight conditions this year in the run-up to their elections. And as a result of that, there's now consensus across Norway that they're not going to build any new electricity interconnectors, even to the extent of not replacing the Skagerrak 3 and 4 links with Denmark, which are coming to end of life. They're expected to close in 2026, and they're not likely to be replaced. So that's going to cut cross-border capacity between Norway and Denmark by around 30%. This is huge. The idea that Norway is reducing its electricity exports to Denmark is a pretty seismic shift. And, there are several parties within the Storting that want to go further. Not only do they want to not build any new ones, and there's really broad consensus around that. I think really only the Norwegian Conservative Party would be open to building new ones, but the governing Labour Party is against it. But you've got people like the Centre Party and the Progress Party. They've said they want to tear up the deals that exist already, the one with Germany and Britain. And of course, Norway's a rich country. They've got so much money in the sovereign wealth fund. They could just rip up those contracts and pay some compensation, and that would be the end of it. There would really not be very much that anyone else could do about it. So I think that Norway is the canary in the coal mine when it comes to this, because they're very transparent. They actually amended their Energy Act twice to give themselves legal powers to restrict exports. I know the EU started bleating and moaning and saying, it's not consistent with trade rules and so on. That's not true, actually. Under WTO rules, you absolutely can reduce exports if your domestic market's under threat, and that would be the motivation for Norway to do it. So that's perfectly legitimate and perfectly consistent with international trading norms. And the EU and Britain will just have to suck it up if that's what Norway decides to do. The talk around not exporting electricity in Norway, and this is a hot button issue. If you stopped a person on the street in London and asked them their opinion about electricity interconnectors, they'd think you were a lunatic and say that they'll call the police if you don't leave them alone. If you go and ask somebody on the streets of Oslo the same question, they're going to bend your ear at length about how the electricity exports are costing them too much money and importing price volatility in their previously low volatility market.
And Martin, one for you, a market question. As I see it, the oil price has been sort of trending down, but there's a sort of bit of life in the UK oil and gas sector, in share price terms lately. The Serica share price, you've obviously been doing some very attractive deals, and your share price has been going up, but others as well.
The UK-centred names are right now heavily trending relative to the possible policy changes that we might see. Obviously, we all typically get impacted by both oil and gas prices, but there clearly can be both micro factors. In our case, obviously, yes, we've been doing some M&A that the market seems to have liked, but I think there's the bigger sort of near-term macro issue that things like that FT article and indeed what we've been discussing on this podcast so far, the signals that seem to be coming out that we may see a shift of sentiment. And in a way, that would be right. Were that to happen, the impact of that on the value that we can create would be material, and it would offset an impact of there's a pretty bearish sentiment on oil prices into 2026. And Kathryn, I think, laid out a pretty consensus view of medium-term gas price direction as well, heading back towards normal levels, right? Let's say. And so, those factors are out there. But, as an industry, we've always taken the view that we can manage price risk and we can manage subsurface risk. Sure. The things that are really difficult to manage is the kind of fiscal and policy uncertainty that's been thrown at us over the last few years.
Yeah, and remembering that, on gas, we're thinking we're going to go back to long-term averages, and plenty of E&P going on during those periods when you had those long-term average prices.
Yes, correct. And we obviously have this factor, Kathryn, that quite often our supply chains costs also flex with the price, right? So that doesn't happen immediately, and you can have periods of pain and buffer and stuff. But yes, overall, the costs tend to adjust as well.
A couple of weeks ago, I was listening to a global energy investor. I think he was somewhere in the US, and he was asked about, where's the good place at the moment to invest? And the oil price has been a bit weak, and it's quite simple. He said the cheapest place in the world right now to buy a barrel of oil is in listed companies in the UK North Sea. And he went on and gave the investment thesis on Harbour Energy. Now, I can't verify whether what he said is true, but he seemed to know what he was talking about. And the reason it's so cheap is because of policy, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, we've had an equity risk premium, if you like, put onto UK oil and gas stocks, which, I had one investor, this is now, it was probably in the really tough times when everything was looking really, really bleak. And I sort of indicated that our government was, this was to an international investor, was more like an emerging market government. And his comment to me was that was too rude on emerging markets. It was absolutely more like frontier markets. The issue that was absolutely acute back in 21, maybe, and, heading into 22, which was access to capital, feels less of an issue. Now it's about this policy point first and foremost.
Yeah, so I was going to come and say that because after 2022, when we saw oil and gas prices spiking in response to the invasion of Ukraine, your ESG funds massively underperformed versus conventional funds. And so you saw fund managers really, remembering that they have a fiduciary duty to their investors and that their primary obligation is to actually generate returns, which they weren't doing. Now, obviously, that's not uniform the way in which investors are approaching this. And I think the banks have been a little bit slower to react to some of those trends. But I think that companies like Serica, and Serica in particular, because of the M&A and the opportunistic behaviours, and not just blowing smoke here, Martin, it has a fair amount of option value there.
Not investment advice, of course.
No, of course. I'm not authorised to give investment advice, But I think if you stand and look at this from a rational perspective, yes, you've got to survive a potentially difficult policy environment up to 2029, if that's when the next election is. But you can have some reasonable confidence that from that point onwards, things will be better. Now, if we can maybe avoid losing too many rigs and too much of the support infrastructure from the North Sea. And if the rigs are just moving over to Norway, that's not such a big deal. But if they're moving over to Africa or the Gulf Coast, then that's obviously a much bigger problem. But there's some definite positive signs there that if you're positioned to take advantage from the pivot that we do expect to happen, and if it doesn't happen now, then it should happen with a high level of certainty after the next election. So if you can get through those tough years, there could be some really good value there. And I think that's probably what investors are seeing.
Yeah, I just wouldn't.
It's not just going to be me that notices that.
I wouldn't quibble with that, Kathryn, except for I really don't think we can afford to wait until the next general election, right? The timing is acute. That's the only...
Well, no, I mean, I agree. But I see that as almost like the worst case scenario would be waiting till the next election.
Listen, I've taken up a lot of your time for both of you. Thank you so much. Is there any parting comments you want to leave with us on this subject?
We need to take a much more pragmatic and hard-headed look at the risks to our energy security. I'm really concerned about how we keep the lights on. The risk factors are coming from, can we maintain the flows of gas into the market in cold weather in the winter if we allow the North Sea infrastructure to erode too far? If we start seeing retirements in our CCGT fleet, if we start seeing asset failures in our transmission infrastructure, how are we going to keep the lights on? And I see that as a huge risk. In Iberia, they obviously had that full peninsular blackout at the end of April. That was really benign weather conditions, and 11 people lost their lives. And, the economic cost was that significant. The blackout at Heathrow, by the way, the cost estimates for that are between 100 and 150 million pounds. And that was just for 12, 15 hours of blackout at Heathrow Airport. So you can imagine if we had a nationwide blackout, there would be fatalities and there would be a very significant economic impact. And so I think that we have been far too laid back around these risks. And with 8-year lead times for new gas turbines, 5-year lead times for new rotors, even a year and a half for the components for major maintenance, it's not obvious how you solve these problems. And so you really can't be leaving it to chance. I think there needs to be a proper action plan, because actually nobody has responsibility for security of supply. That's the shocking thing. No one entity within Britain is responsible for keeping the lights on. And so, yeah, exactly. It's kind of shocking. People think there's, NESO, but no, NESO just has to meet certain conditions like maintaining frequency within plus or minus 1% of 50 hertz and having at least enough reserve to cover the single largest in-feed loss. But that's to do with sudden blackouts. It's not to do with, oh, we just didn't have enough power stations, or, oh, guess what, a big chunk of the grid fell over because some critical transformers failed. And that's even before you start thinking about what bad actors could do. This is all just what might happen because we've allowed our assets to erode. So I'm really concerned about those things. And I would really, really like to see much more effort being undertaken by government to make sure these risks are being properly managed.
So maybe buy Serica energy shares, but definitely buy a diesel generator. I think that's what you're saying.
I actually do have a diesel generator.
Yes, you said. Martin.
All I would say, Jeremy, is it's an absolutely crucial 2 weeks that we have ahead of us now. And I say 2 weeks because we're expecting two things in the next 2 weeks. One being the results of the future of the North Sea consultation, which is really, they called it that, but it's essentially licensing. And the other being the budget and what happens to EPL. It's the combination of those two things. It's those two things acting in stereo with joined up policy that will dictate whether we have a good future that can actually be a contributor to all of the security supply and economic aspects or not. So critical timing. And that's really all I would leave it with.
Fascinating. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Brought to you by Progressive Equity.